The Old Testament as narrative. Have you ever wondered what some of the passages and the stories in the Old Testament mean? I know I have. Welcome back to Curious Christianity. I'm Adam, and today I want to talk about interpreting parts of the Old Testament. Now, I've been studying Genesis a lot, and I think it's important that we realize the Old Testament isn't nearly as clear as far as interpreting what it is that's going on. I think far more often than not, the Old Testament is telling us what the moral of the story is through what happens. It's not being didactic like Paul. Paul just kind of tells us, do this, don't do this is bad, this is good. And sure, there's theological concepts in there. But the stories in the Old Testament, they're telling us this is good, this is bad because of what happens. I think it's interesting. Somebody once brought up the idea about polygamy, and they brought up all of the polygamous stories where we see men who married multiple wives. But their further point was to point out that virtually all of the stories that dealt with polygamy are pretty negative. There aren't really a lot of good results. And so I think it's important to recognize when we're looking at these stories, what happens. And I've thought a lot about that in reading the stories of Jacob and making connections between the story of Jacob and what happens to Jacob. Jacob does some bad things, and I think ultimately he kind of reaps the results from that. And the story is telling us that it's bad based on what happens. It's not simply just telling us, like, oh, yeah, see, he did this here, therefore bad. And I think that we get lost a little bit when we just try and read the story and say, oh, that was interesting. But we don't actually ask any further questions of the story. Well, why did this happen? Why did God allow this? Why did so and so do this or that or the other thing? And I think the more that we dive into those stories and ask those kind of questions, the more clear the picture can become. So when we're trying to understand some of the portions of Genesis, I think we have to be a little bit inquisitive because it's not trying to tell us just by reading it. It's trying to get us to think about what is it that it's saying. It's creating a story. And I think like when we watch movies, more often we get it because we sit and watch the whole movie. And then sometimes the end of the movie is speaking back to earlier parts of the movie. And our problem sometimes as American Christians is we read like the first part of the story and think it's just its own contained story all by itself, and it's isolated from the rest of the story. It's isolated away from the other details, when really sometimes the later details are calling back to something that happened earlier. Let me give you one solid example of this. The story of David and Saul. King Saul is hunting down David. He's hunting down David, and he finally has him a little bit cornered, and he decides to relieve himself. And David goes in there and cuts a piece of his robe off, having the full opportunity to kill Saul at that moment. And then David reveals himself to Saul and says, hey, see here, I had the opportunity to get you, but I didn't do it. And King Saul says something kind of interesting. He says, well, behold, David, you are a better man than I am. And this is significant because it was when Samuel had visited Saul, and Samuel knew that Saul had fallen out of favor with God because he didn't obey God and offered the sacrifices beforehand. He was supposed to wait for Samuel, but he didn't. And so Samuel turns to leave, and Saul goes and grabs the edge of his cloak and tears off a piece. And Samuel says to him, behold, just as you've torn off a piece of my cloak, so will God tear away the kingdom of Israel from you and give it to a man better than you. So when David holds up that piece of cloth, It's as though Saul was having a small flashback of exactly that prophecy that Samuel told him. And he finally acknowledges, indeed, you are a better man than I, and acknowledges that this is the man whom God is going to give the kingdom. And that's just one of the illustrations where it's like, were you reading the story? Were you making the connections that are in the story? So when we read Genesis, I think we need to pay attention to the full story. And sometimes the story is calling back to something that it was doing earlier.